Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Albums That Look Heavy But Aren't. Did you guys ever walk into record stores back in the day, before there was internet and ways that we could really check these things out? You'd see a particular album and you'd think, man, that looks really heavy. That is going to rock. And then you maybe even bought it, went home, and you said, what the heck? This doesn't sound anything like the album cover looks like. Well, I've got a bunch of those here that we are going to talk about, and there's some that are surprising. There's some that I think are a given, and we'll get into all that here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also, leave a comment, hit like. All those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you'll never miss a video just like this with albums that look heavy but aren't. Okay, so no particular order here, but I wanted to start off with the one that, at least for me, was the one that growing up I always saw, and I thought this was going to be the heaviest album. I didn't know the band at the time. I didn't know anything about them. I'm talking about English rock band Uriah Heep and Abominog from 1982. Just look at that album cover, how sinister that is. And I would see this thing and I thought, oh my God, this must be one of the heaviest metal bands out there. But, all in all, they're not. So this is their 14th studio album. It was first to feature new vocalist Peter Golby in the lineup and also new guitar or keyboard player John Sinclair taking over for Ken Hensley. So there's some big changes going on within the band itself. And they had retooled their sound, which probably is what led to this album cover. They were doing much more of the pop metal sounding stuff. Still not very heavy metal, but pop metal nonetheless. And, going for what was popular at the time. This is 1982. Metal was a big thing. New wave of British heavy metal was exploding. This band obviously being before that, but maybe trying to cash in a little bit on it. And so the album art on this thing here was actually done by Lee Edwards. But for me, as I said, this looked a lot like a really heavy album, and I wasn't yet into thrash, so I was thinking this had to be thrash metal. The album art itself looks a little bit like Pushead's art from Metallica, so that's where my mind went on this. Ultimately, we probably all know who Uriah Heep is today, but Uriah Heep is just a good straight-up hard rock band, kind of in the vein of Deep Purple, maybe not even as heavy as that. So this was a big shock for me the first time I heard it. And the funny thing is, always kind of been a little hard getting past this album cover because everything else is not like this, but this one here, at least, really threw me for a loop. All right, next one up, Scottish rock band Nazareth in No Mean City. So this was their 10th studio album. And again, just look at this character on the cover, the skull face, the blades, just everything about it, for me at least, screams metal. I mean, it's like Eddie from Iron Maiden album covers. And so I'd be thinking this is gonna sound like Maiden or maybe even heavier than that sort of stuff. Ultimately, it doesn't. It's more straight ahead rock in the sort of boogie rock vein. It was very commercially successful for them. The album itself was 1979, so right at the beginning of the new wave of British heavy metal movement. And again, probably helping it to cash in on some of that aesthetic and things that were going on at the time. The album itself was the first to feature Zal Clemson, who came from sensational Alex Harvey band. So a little bit change. And I've noticed that with a lot of these, as I was putting this together, the bands were going through changes. And I think maybe that's where some of these different album covers came from. They were kind of trying to change their image a bit. So the album art on this is done by Rodney Matthews. And you guys should know that name. That person has done a lot of different album art covers for many different bands. Asia, Rick Wakeman, Magnum, and a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands like Praying Mantis, Tigers of Pantang, Diamond Head. So totally understandable why the art looks the way the art does. But again, it just wasn't that heavy. By the time I got around to this band and listened to this, I was shocked by just how straight ahead rock and roll this sounding album is, and not as metal looking or as sinister looking as this album cover is. So always fun, always interesting, later on. And I would avoid these albums early on, thinking they are going to be too heavy for me. And again, I'm talking about when I was a kid, not knowing any different and not having the internet and stuff where we could check this stuff out and stream it. And, today album covers don't much matter. You can just look up, listen to something right away and know. But if you didn't know, you had to just take chances on stuff. And a lot of times, the way I did it was in the very early 90s when LPs, when vinyl was, dirt cheap and wasn't worth anything, I could go into my local record store and get them for like 10 for $1. And I'd try a lot of bands that way. All right, next one up is English progressive rock band Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Brain Salad Surgery from 1973. So this one's very early on. Fourth studio album. Did receive mixed reviews at the time, but ultimately grew in stature. It was successful. It went gold in the end and features probably one of their biggest hits on it, Carn Evil 9. That was like maybe the one and only song I even knew about the band when I first decided to start exploring them. But this album art is H.R. Geiger, a Swiss artist who I knew from the Ridley Scott film in 1979, the sci-fi horror classic Alien. So I was always intrigued by this because I would look at this and knew it was H.R. Geiger. But because he did this sci-fi horror thing, and I know that came after because this album is 1973, but I would look at this and think it's gotta be heavy. I mean, it's gotta be dark, right? And it's not. I mean, it is symphonic, orchestrated, bombastic. It's anything but heavy. And just, I was so shocked the first time I heard this because I wanted it to be metal and it was not. So just another one like that, that ultimately the mind was changed and these things grew on me later on. But at the time, I was so disappointed the first time I heard these things. Okay, next one up, Southern rock band Molly Hatchet, their self-titled release from 1978, debut album. The band was coming out at a time filling the void from Leonard Skinner, who had died in the plane crash, or multiple members did, and the band ended, and I think that was like 77. And Southern rock was at the end of its boom, so it was going down, probably a lot to do with the plane crash from Leonard Skinner. But ultimately, this band comes out and maybe taking an image like this to help bridge itself and not be so straight on Southern rock looking, because remember 1978, this tail end here was the beginning of heavy metal's real rise. And they were not at all, they're Southern rock, they're boogie rock, but the album art is done by fantasy and science fiction artist Frank Frazetta, who's done all kinds of different things, become very famous. I actually don't know, maybe he was even famous before, but certainly become very famous from having done all these Molly Hatchet album covers. But this one in particular always caught my eye. And if you knew the title of it, it was called Death Dealer, which makes it just even more ominous knowing that. But seeing this album art and looking at it and not knowing that it was Southern rock, again, I grew up thinking Molly Hatchet, and the name Molly Hatchet too, the axe murderer. So you've got a band named after an axe murderer. You've got this crazy album art here with someone carrying an axe. And to me, it just screamed everything heavy metal. But of course, as we know, it's not. It's nowhere near as heavy as, heavy metal style album covers that are that. And of course, it's always funny when it works in reverse, because there's some real heavy bands too that have album covers that make them look nothing like what they are. So we could probably even do a video in reverse, albums that look not heavy but are. All right, next one up here goes to American rock band Elf and their self-titled release from 1972, debut album, featuring Ronnie James Dio. So with an album cover like this and the name Ronnie James Dio, you might say, oh, well, that's well expected, right? But the music that's on here is nowhere near as heavy as his later day era stuff with either Rainbow, Sabbath, or the solo stuff. But an album cover like this screams that sort of sound. And yet it's 1972. And really, the stuff that's on here is just straight up rock, kind of retro rock almost. A little bit of boogie flavor, some soul, it's got some horns on it. It's just not at all what I would have expected. And when, of course, I was going backwards and buying this because it did have Ronnie James Dio, and the backing band here was the backing band for Ritchie Blackmore in his debut album from Rainbow. So of course I'm expecting at a minimum for this to sound like Rainbow or have that Ronnie James Dio sound, and it doesn't. And so that was just one of those things. Now the artist for this is, trying to say his name right, Hiroshi Morishima. And just look at it. It's a very sinister album cover. I mean, this could have been Elf without this, Elf character making that face, but it makes it look very ominous, evil, and the music isn't anything but that. So what's interesting is that this band here also has David Feinstein, and David Feinstein would go on to play guitar in front. The next one I'm going to show you guys, which is American hard rock band, The Rods. And so look at those two things together, and yet neither of these bands are full-on metal. This one here, Wild Dogs in 1982, second studio album. David, he would, get the nickname Rock Feinstein. And this one here done by Lee Edwards. And Lee Edwards having done, I think is it No Mean City? Let's jump back and see here. So we've got, no, sorry, he did Abominog. I knew I'd heard that one earlier. So same artist who did this one would go on to do this one here. So this person doing art that looked very heavy. And while this one here is much harder rock than Elf and is in that hard rock vein, it's not metal. But so for me at least, never as heavy as this looked, especially an album from 1982 when you see this and what you would expect. But I did want to point it out because we had a member of Elf going on to this band doing or having an album cover that I felt was much in the same vein as some of these other ones we're looking at. All right, now this next band here comes from the new wave of British heavy metal movement. And even though there's metal in the name of that there, this album here for me is anything but metal. And I'm talking about the band Demon. Night of the Demon, 1981 debut studio album. Just look at that grotesque album cover and what that is. When I saw this, I would have expected something like Venom, who is another new wave of British heavy metal band, or even something heavier. So for a very long time, I actually thought this band here was a death metal band. And I just passed by it. I thought they were a newer band. In fact, I didn't even think that they were part of the new wave of British heavy metal scene. And then one time I heard a song that I really liked and I Shazammed it and it said Demon. And I looked up what it came from, Night of the Demon. And when I saw this album cover, I was really shocked because this music is just good, straight up hard rock, good straight rock even. Clean vocals that are on it. So it's nothing like you would expect from metal. And yet, look at our album cover. And then if we open this up, I'm going to pop the CD out to show you. This is the way the band looked. So even that in and of itself, I mean, just look at it. It screams devil and, death and just all kinds of things going along with that album or band name of Demon. So the album art on here is created by Kari. I think it's a French word. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. But I just dark, disgusting, ominous, deadly looking. And it wasn't something that I really wanted to sit and digest and look at for any length of time. And for me, I'm a very visual person. I love album art. I like to look at album art. It should, to me, represent the band and the sound where you can really kind of sink your eyes, so to speak, into it while your ears are digesting the music. And this, it's not that. In fact, it's not an album cover I want to stare at for too long. All right, and the last one here is American rock band Grateful Dead, Blues for Allah from 1975. So I like a little bit of Grateful Dead, but I don't own a lot. In fact, I have found that I own most of their albums that are not the ones that have the art on it that to me looks heavier than it is. But I do have a greatest hits in my collection, and it's just that idea of the skeleton that they use a lot of. And I remember growing up thinking that the Grateful Dead, and that name, Grateful Dead, those skeletons, those album covers, I thought they were a heavy metal band. And it wasn't until the early 90s when I found out that they were not at all. In fact, coming from the 60s, even a bit of folk rock in there. This album in particular mixes their jazz fusion influences at the time, got some Middle Eastern flavors in it. So it's one of those things like every time I try to go back and see if there's kind of a harder, heavier rock album by the band, there really isn't at all. And just not at all, in my opinion, sounding the way that the art for their album or the character of that skeleton that's on so many of their album covers. The art itself was done by Philip Garris, and it just shows the fizzy-haired skeleton, sunglasses, playing a fiddle. I mean, I thought it was the coolest, baddest art at the time, and was absolutely shocked the first time I heard some Grateful Dead music, and just was like, what is this? Right? And as I said, with all of these bands here, my taste changed over the years, and I got into a lot of these bands and I gave them a try. And even though they weren't the metal stuff that I thought they were, the heavy stuff that I thought they were, I've learned a lot. Not learned, I just began to love a lot of these bands for what they are. But, there you go. 8 albums that look heavy that aren't. Did any of these catch you guys off guard the first time you heard them? Let me know albums that you think look heavy that aren't. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a good one. And I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.